Lord of Mountains, a novel of the change, by S.M. Stirling. Narrated by Todd, McLaren. Copyright 2012 by S.M. Stirling. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with S.M. Stirling and Scoville, Galen Ghosh Literary Agency, and was produced in the year 2012 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Prologue. The High King's Host. Horse Heaven Hills, formerly South Central Washington. High Kingdom of Montival, formerly Western North America. October 28th, Change Year 25, 2023 A.D. "He is coming," Rudi whispered again. Then he shook himself and let his hand fall from the crystal pommel of the sword. His helmet was already slung from the high pommel of the war-saddle, and the wind cuffed at his long, red-blond hair, giving an illusion of coolness as it dried the sweat bred in the rage and heat of battle. "Where? When?" Mathilda said sharply, her strong-featured face frowning a little under the raised visor of her own sallet. It was a bright autumn noon, and the rolling hills showed a ghostly tinge of green under their summer's cloak of golden sun-dried grass. The first of the autumn rains had already fallen. It would have been a fair day, except for the thick drifts of dead men and horses on and around the hill where his rear guard had made their stand. Most of them were enemy, horse archers from the wilds of Montana, men of the Church Universal and Triumphant. But more than enough were Montivalans. They'd held hard, the Yakima pike and crossbow regiments and the Association cavalry, and he'd arrived at just the right moment with another 1,000 lancers to be the hammer to their anvil. "Soon," he said to his High Queen, looking eastward. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The Prophet Sathaz will be here and ready." Above them, a glider turned in a greater circle, with a glitter of aluminum and plexiglass. One of his, a pre-change craft that needed no engine to fly, catapult-launched over the Columbia cliffs and riding the updrafts like a great winged bird. His eyes turned grimly to the wheeling circle of living carrion-eaters below the human machine, ravens and buzzards, tilting lower as the living humans withdrew. Comrade or foe, all the dead waited for them alike. She nodded, following his thought. They'd been friends, Anamchara, oath-bound kin of the soul, from the age of 10, though their parents had been at war then, and they'd been from Montival all across the continent to Nantucket and back together. Though they'd only been handfasted a bit more than a month, their minds operated with the sort of smooth unison he'd seen in couples 40 years their senior. Tiffaine Doth, Grand Constable of the Association, looked exhausted, but grimly satisfied. He'd given her the task of delaying the enemy onset, and she'd managed a fighting retreat all the way from Walla Walla without letting the enemy trap her force. "And as is the usual case, I shall reward her good work with more work. Lady Doth, your field force is hereby dissolved with accolades for good service. I wanted you to screen us while we massed, and you've done just that. The Arriere Ban of the PPA has mustered, and you're in command of that, of course. You'll deploy the Association foot to the right wing of our position, and the chivalry will be part of our general reserve." "Forward bases at Goldendale, Your Majesty," she said. "Yes, and our field hospitals and supplies will stage out of there. Mathilda has been overseeing our build-up in the area. Matty, you'd better brief the Grand Constable." She nodded, and Doth scrubbed at a spray of blood across her long, stark-boned face. "I'll get there and see about slotting people in then," the Grand Constable said. "Her Majesty can brief me on the way back." Rudi nodded. "I'll be there by dawn tomorrow. We'll have everything up within 2 days, except the rear guard. There's enough forward to hold, but I don't expect the onset until then." She nodded back. "They'll want to have everything in place. They have the advantage of numbers, after all." The High King of Montival grinned starkly. "Yes, and we'll see what we can do about that." Chapter 1. County of Aurea, formerly Central Washington. High Kingdom of Montival, formerly Western North America. October 30th, change year 25, 2023 AD. Rudi had been inclined to think the final ball a waste of time and resources, one of the peacocking associate habits that he had to put up with for the sake of harmony, and which the North Realm nobles insisted upon even on the eve of battle. And perhaps there was an element of sheer vanity in it. But on second thought, who should say how a man prepares his innermost self to die? Or a woman, sure. They have to be here. And the most of their ladies, too, for they're working in the field hospitals, or managing the supplies, or something of that sort, waiting for their lovers and brothers to be brought back on their shields. The only real burden is that they've brought their party clothes, garb they call it, along this far. And we're close to the river. There's a certain mad gallantry to it, a defiance of fate. My foster father says the Duke of Wellington's officers did the same thing on the eve of Waterloo. Torches and fires of pine wood in iron cages, and strings of softly glowing paper lanterns lit the interior of Castle Goldendale's Bailey Court, the broad paved expanse at the heart of the inner keep. The great hall and the chapel and the quarters of the seneschal and his officers surrounded it in an irregular circuit of roofs and balconies, spires and pointed arch windows. Candles glowed in the church, through the rich colors of stained glass, wrought saints and angels. Mathilda and some others had had their mass there, though most of the hosts had used household chaplains and field priests in the encampments. A lingering scent of incense mingled with burning conifer sap and the cool night air. Sparks drifted heavenward. The narrower slits of the solars and guard-rooms and the high round towers of the keep were bars of yellow against the half-glimpsed soaring heights, as much sensed as seen where their dark bulk blocked out the stars. Folk more humble crowded some of them. The castle staff, maidservants and men-at-arms, watching the gaudy flower-petal brightness below as a show arranged for their entertainment. Black-armored spearmen of the Protector's Guard stood at intervals around the enclosure, motionless as statues of gleaming dark metal, with the visors of their sallet-helms down, and leaving nothing to be seen but an occasional glint of eyes behind the vision-slits, the gleam echoing the yellow and scarlet of the lidless eye on shields, like 4-foot elongated teardrops. Kilted longbowmen of the High King's archers shared the duty, and honor, with their great yew bows in the crooks of their arms. The walls enclosed the sound of the players as well. Shawm and lute and recorder and viol, the sweet tinkle and buzz and fluting notes of Portlander court music. The tune ended, and the dancers turned and bowed or curtsied to politely applaud the musicians on the dais. Several of them had the jeweled dagger that denoted associate status, or even the golden spurs of chivalry on their heels, for a troubadour might be a gentleman by Protectorate standards. The tale of the dance would be woven into that of the battle to come, for they'd be fighting in it, too. 5 minutes, the mistress of the revel said. She was Dame Lilianth of Calama, who did something administrative for the Grand Constable most of the time. Then the Knights of Portland, gentlemen, chevaliers, demoiselles, and ladies. Her shrewd eyes took in the situation, and she made an almost imperceptible gesture. everyone except the two nobles with whom he'd been talking business withdrew enough to give a degree of privacy as Mathilda came up to him. She was wearing a dark chocolate cotehardie with tight sleeves that showed rounds of her pale flesh between each button, and a headdress with two low peaks in warm, dark gold silk and pearls. It made a striking contrast to the tone of her sleek brown hair, where it showed at the sides in elaborate braided coils, and she was laughing as she extended a hand to him. "I need a partner for this one, darling," Mathilda said, as he caught it in his and raised it to his lips. "And if you won't dance with me, it'll have to be Tiff here, and that would be a scandal. Delia can make me dance in public, but only at home on our own barony, and when she's not 9 months pregnant," Tiffane Doth said. "Besides, how did our Lady Regent put it?" She nodded towards the spot where the Lady Regent and a few other dowagers and lords with a good deal of grey in their hair sat, with pages offering tiny crystal glasses of liqueurs or brandy snifters on trays. Ah, modern protectorate culture doesn't handle gender confusion well. Which reminds me, since it's from her private stash, I could use another cognac. Lioncel. No, serve His Majesty first. A tow-haired young squire slid forward noiselessly and poured for them both. Lady Death, as she was commonly known, was dressed to fit her nickname tonight. Her tight hose were onyxine black, as was the sleeveless neck-to-thigh jerkin of soft chamois, fastened up the front to the throat with ties of black silk and jet. Her soft court shoes were chamois as well, and the toes turned up, moderately. The loose, black, knee-length hoopland overrobe had buttons of some dark, mottled tropical wood, so hard it seemed metallic, carved like black roses, and a collar open at the front and ear-high behind. The lower hem was dagged, and so were the turned-back sleeves that hung almost as low, showing a dark forest green lining. Only the links of her belt and the buckles at the ankles of her shoes showed brighter colors. "I wear hose and hoopland fairly often too, Tiff," the High Queen replied. "Yes, but not at formal dances, Your Majesty," Tiffane said. "Delia has to arrange it carefully even at Montanor Manor, or people end up turning and bonking heads and knocking each other over when they should be switching line, trying to figure out where I fit." "Now you're drawing the longbow," Mathilda laughed. "Young gentlewomen learn who's on the right and left by dancing with each other." "I wouldn't know," Tiffane shrugged, deadpan. "I spent my teenage years as your mother's assassin." Mathilda gave a chuckle that was half a wince. That was a joke, and the more effective for being literally true, which was how Tiffane's rare excursions into humor usually worked. "Half the time in a youngster's dancing class it's all girls anyway," Mathilda said. "Yes, but it would be fun if it all seized up like that, wouldn't it?" Tiffane said, her face expressionless as she sipped her brandy. "Sure, and the prospect of a battle relaxes her," Rudi thought, amused. "I've rarely seen her so whimsical." "I would be honored to dance with you if all else fails, Your Majesty," Rigobert de Stafford, Baron Forest Grove, said gallantly with a low bow, sweeping off his round chaperon hat with its rolled brim and dangling liripipe tail. "Yes, but you'd outshine me totally, my Lord Forest Grove," Maddie said with a smile and a little mock curtsy in return. "Or, since he's wearing a skirt, I could dance with His Majesty." "In your dreams, Rigobert," Rudi said genially. "And it's a kilt. Calling it a skirt has been known to turn Mackenzies berserk." De Stafford was a ruggedly handsome man in his 40s, with a short-cropped golden beard and bold-cut hair too fair to show the first grey strands, broad shoulders, thick wrists, and large hands that were shapely but scarred where they rested on his belt of golden flowers. His court dress emphasized gold and scarlet down to the party-colored hose. Nothing too gaudy by northern fashion, but still a blaze of color and jewelry, including the chain of office that marked him as March Warden of the South. For height and coloring, He and Dath could have been siblings, though he was 6 or 7 years older. His wife, Delia, was chatelaine of Ath, an arrangement which suited all three of them very well indeed, for a multitude of reasons. Mathilda's teasing manner dropped away.
"This one's a little political, Rudi," she said. "The High King has to participate in the last dance of the evening. Sort of a fealty thing."
"I haven't even been crowned yet, and already there's protocol." Mathilda nodded, entirely serious.
"It's a chant du Brabant step, but with a new lyric. Or so Mother told me. One of her troubadours came up with it, modifying some old society piece, I think. She says they hardly need to be prompted anymore."
"Yes," Tefane said, in her ice-water voice. "Apparently a genuine monarch, blessed by a visitation of the Virgin." "That was Father Ignatius. Lord Chancellor Ignatius now," Rudi pointed out. "I am a pagan, and I had a vision of the threefold goddess."
"Ignatius was one of the companions of the quest," Dath said. "In propaganda terms, the Lady Regent assures me you bask in each other's reflected glory, but it shines more strongly upward. Is that irony, or is she just copying the way Sandra usually speaks?"
Rudi thought. The Grand Constable of the Association went on.
"A High King married to our princess, accompanied by signs and wonders, with a magic sword gained on a heroic quest, gets their artistic juices flowing to the point where they barely need a subsidy from the crown."
"She used the phrase, creaming their hose, in fact," Rigobert said. "Archaic vocabulary, but expressive." Rudi sighed gently and set his brandy snifter on a low, round table of polished granite. His mother-in-law had always been shrewd enough to know that song and story were as much tools of power as hoarded gold, or castles, or catapults and men-at-arms. Sometimes he suspected that she really didn't know quite how powerful they were, though. A glance in her direction brought her up to her feet, and then down in a curtsy, spreading the pearl-gray silk of her skirts and sinking gracefully, her smooth, middle-aged face smiling and revealing nothing except her usual cat-like satisfaction, as he bowed slightly in return.
"Sometimes when she's sitting with a white Persian in her lap, it's downright eerie how similar they look," he thought whimsically. "And I will never know precisely how much of what's happened hereabouts these last 2 decades was by her plan and will, and what wasn't. And what wasn't but was fitted and shaped to suit her afterwards behind the screen of her wit, like my blood father killing her husband, the end result of which is that her grandchildren, and his, will rule all of Montival. So who was the victor, and who the vanquished, on the field of the cloth of gold?"
"All right, Akushla," he said to his wife. "I will be most honored and pleased to lead the dance."
"And I'll be back in a moment. Don't discover an emergency elsewhere, my love, or I will challenge you to a joust à l'outrance with sharpened lances."
Their eyes met, and for a moment he lost himself in the warm, brown depths of hers. "Get a room, you two monarchs," de Stafford said. Rudi laughed. "The palace isn't built yet, my lord." The sword of the lady was hung in his quarters, with a score of the High King's archers as an honor guard. Not that he thought any human agency was much threat to it. It had been hard enough for him to come to it undamaged, but that absence let him pretend he was simply a man among his own kind tonight, and such chances were rare enough to relish. Mathilda moved back into the open, circulating among the younger noblemen and ladies. A lady-in-waiting and a squire. "Isolu, Demoiselle de Gervais," he reminded himself. 17, with tilted blue eyes and a maiden's loose hair streaming in a yellow mane down from under a pale blue headdress, just on the verge of turning from pretty and fresh to spectacular.
And her brother Huon, 3 years younger. By Brigid's cauldron and Lou's spear, He looks more and more like Odard every day, save that his eyes are dark.
Moved among the revelers, collecting little folded pamphlets they'd been studying. Those would have the steps and music. He closed his eyes for a moment and remembered grief, remembering also the look of almost mocking affection in Odard's own, as he lay dying so far away in Coxthorpe on the shores of the cold Atlantic. It had been a long way for a knight of the Association to go to die. And it hadn't been until he died that Rudi had fully realized how real a friend he'd become after years of not quite trust. Odard had been a very complex man, but the steel had been there at the core when the Keeper of Laws came to reveal what he really was.
No man outlives his fate, he thought. He died as well as a man can when it's far from home amid angry strangers. Ah, but Odard, I miss you at my back this day.
Sandra Arminger raised her glass to him, as his glance passed her again. She was talking to a barrel-built nobleman with a shaved head and rich, dark clothing, with a silver and gold-linked chain of office around his bull neck, marking him as Conrad Renfrew, Count of Odell, and Chancellor of the Portland Protective Association. Rudi snorted slightly, taking up the snifter to return the toast, and then sipping at the smooth fire within the balloon's shape. The man beside Portland's Lady Regent inclined his massive head, one corner of his mouth turning up in an ironic smile that twisted the hideous white keloid scars that covered much of his face.
"Your Majesty?"
Tefane asked.
"I was just thinking that the Count of Odell over there led the army that tried to conquer the Mackenzie Duchas back in the War of the Eye, and nearly did burn Sutter down to the ground. Some of the round shot from his catapults are in the walls still. Yet here we are, allies, and more or less friends. For by his sons most definitely are my friends, if not my closest."
Tefane turned her snifter between her hands, the long, slender, wire-strong fingers flexing about the glass. She'd been 14 or so on that day in 1998, in whose shadow the whole world lived, which made her one of the bridge generation between folks such as Sandra or Conrad, who'd been adults then, and his own generation, the changelings.
"For that matter, I kidnapped you a bit before that, when I did that clandestine op to get Maddie back," she pointed out. "And killed your bodyguards. I mourned them," Rudi said sincerely. "For I liked Aoife and Leoth well, and keened them as sincerely as a 10-year-old could," he thought. "I make a sacrifice beneath the tree where their ashes lie mingled every year. But—"
He tactfully didn't mention the earlier attempt, when the first Baron Gervais, Eddie Liu, and Katrina Georges had tried to get Maddie back and failed, and both died in the process. Katrina had been Tefane's first lover, and he knew she still mourned her, even though she'd been happily settled with Delia de Stafford for a decade and a half. Rudi had been a hostage at Castle Ath when the newly ennobled Tefane met Delia, who'd been a mere miller's daughter on the estate then. People in general thought Tefane Dath's most notable characteristic was a ruthlessness as complete and hard as the honed steel on the edge of a knife. But if Rudi had had to sum up her mind and character, it would have been constancy he'd have put first. Though she's ruthless enough, too, and no dispute. She was also an intensely private person, and he went on instead, "But that was honest war. We'd raided the Association territories and took Matty after all, and killed quite a few of her entourage in the process. And then you saved my life, you and Sandra between you. The Lord Protector would have killed me, sure, in the end, if I'd stayed in Tuddenangst like a bit of grit under his eye. You taken me off to your new fief." "That was Lady Sandra's orders. She got me the title and the grant for rescuing Maddie and snatching you, after all," Tefane said judiciously. "Mind you, I agreed on taking you out of sight and mind.
and even then it only delayed matters. Norman was like that. God, how I hated that man. I used to daydream about killing him. He turned his head sharply for a moment. It was unusual for her to express that much emotion. Her long, handsome, regular face was as calm as ever, and her pale gray eyes calmly considering as they flicked over the crowd looking for threats and weaknesses. That appraisal was probably so automatic that she would require an act of will to stop it. And it's a fair bit I've learned from her in all the years since. Much of the art of the sword, just for a beginning.
Rigobert snorted. You weren't the only one, my Lady Doth, even in the Protectorate. Lady Sandra actually loved him, though.
Aphrodite is a powerful goddess, Rudi said seriously.
That was both literally and metaphorically true, if there was a difference in the changed world. He drew the invoking sign and went on.
And Seaborn Cyprian has her own purposes when she bestows her gifts. For that matter, Norman loved Sandra and Mathilda, in his way. I think it was his desire to look well in Mathilda's eyes that preserved me when I first fell into his power. We were already close friends from her time at Dun Juniper.
The two associate nobles nodded. They were both nominal Catholics, of course, but he knew to feign wasn't one in practice. That owl he'd glimpsed once on a chain under her shirt was a hint at exactly how not. And he strongly suspected Rigobert wasn't either in his heart, though we didn't know what powers the man did follow. Sandra was that modern rarity, a complete atheist, or had been until recently. Not that she'd ever given any public indication of disbelief, but he suspected that the sheer, overwhelming evidence of late had made her slide from joyfully hypocritical and political lip service to the Protectorate's established church to something more sincere. She had the unusual sort of mind that used logic and evidence to produce conclusions, rather than the other way around. Mathilda finished her task and came back to him, curtsying. He bowed in turn, making a leg in the clan's fashion, his shoulder-length red-gold hair flowing forward. His garb was his own people's festival style. Fine, pleated tartan kilt to just above the knee, with silver-buckled shoes and a little bone and silver-hilted ski-and-do tucked into his right sock hose. Tight green Montrose jacket with a double row of silver buttons. Lace at throat and cuffs. Badgerskin sporran and tooled leather belt and dirk. Scots bonnet, with a spray of black feathers in the clasp that marked his septotem as raven, and a great brooch of silver and jet graven and curling knotwork to hold the plaid pinned across his torso. There was a slight sigh from a clump of ladies nearby. His 6'2" of broad-shouldered, narrow-waisted, long-limbed height took full advantage of clothing designed to show a man off.
"Every woman here is envying me,"
Mathilda said softly, as she laid the tips of her fingers on the back of his left hand to let him lead her out on the dancing floor.
"Except our friend the Grand Constable and a few others," he whispered back. "Some of them envying me, perhaps. And then my Lord de Stafford might well be envying you, you know."
Then he grinned more widely as she pinched his wrist painfully with a hand strengthened steel-hard by years holding the grip of a 15-pound knight's shield.
"You're incorrigible." "No, I'm the improbable bearer of an impossible sword. Nevertheless, I exist. Your mother doesn't seem worried, by the way," he murmured to Mathilda.
She kept her head high and step gliding, so that she seemed to drift forward in a rustle of silks, as if her feet were motionless, floating a fraction of an inch above the smooth stone paving blocks. It was as much a product of rigorous training as a swordsman's stance in its way.
"Mother doesn't worry about battles," she said. "Not that way, at least. She picks people to fight them by judging their character and record, she told me once, and gives them everything they need, then sits back and lets them do their work. Well, the powers picked me, but from Sandra's point of view, There's not much difference, eh?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?